Welcome to our week one lecture. If I could give this lecture a nickname, it would be the benefits of conflict. So we are going to dive right in to the information we need. The very first thing I want to do, the preamble to defining conflict and the benefits of conflict, is really talk about communication and interpersonal communication specifically, and how we define what is interpersonal communication so that we and kind of really dispel some myths about communication. So I'm going to do that right out of the gate here, and then I'll move into the conflict management, conflict resolution piece and really get our definition. We're going to move through historical definitions of conflict and end up with our Hocker and Wilmot, which is the textbook definition that I posted the chapter 1, and then kind of do a preview of how we're going to even move that definition into more contemporary understandings of conflict. This class is not a debate class. It's not a rhetoric class. Even though conflict can often feel like a debate. It's my side or your side, it's my way or the highway, right? We can feel like we're in this tug of war, this adversarial opposition, but we're really looking at conflict management as a path for connection, as a path for productive relationship building, and most importantly, this class is a class about well-being and your own health, and how we handle conflict in our life has a direct impact on our own well-being and of course the well-being of others. Okay, so let's get started on the nature of communication itself, especially interpersonal communication. So I think I mentioned this in the very first video I did, but there's different ways that we divide up the field of communication studies. Rhetoric is really persuasion and ethics, and then we move into, although ethics are a part of everything. And then we move into interpersonal, there's group, there's organizational communication, there's, which some of you have taken my organizational communication class. And there's also the fields of health communication and relationship, romantic and other type of relationship communications like family and stuff like this. So, I mean, and then there's like environmental communication, which is something I also apply my conflict management skills to in my PhD program, where I am writing about, I write and study water conflict specifically and look at environmental conflicts. So, that's just to give you kind of this overview that there's a lot of ways to think about the field of communication studies. And when we narrow down on interpersonal communication, we are really looking at the transaction of a dyad. A dyad is a conversation between two people. Dyad is the two. So the transactional element of it is that you have a sender and a receiver. You have someone sending a message and receiving a message. But in most transactional models, these are face-to-face interactions. Even if you were just one person watching this video, that's not an interpersonal interaction because we don't have any back and forth at all. So we really call these two people communicators, because in a face-to-face action, even if this one isn't sending the primary linguistic message, as a listener, we also consider that a listener is also sending messages through different nonverbal channels. And so that's when we really grapple with the paradox, the puzzle of communication, and how all these different channels, language isn't the only channel. There's, in the field of nonverbal communication, even thumbs are considered a separate channel than gestures. Eyes are considered a different channel than the face. feet are a separate channel, and just, it just goes on and on. The voice has like 6 different channels of communication. There's a lot going on. So this is why when we talk about the transaction, and there's a sender and a receiver of messages, they're doing it simultaneously. And that makes it a lot more complicated. When we're in our own communication events, our own conversations, it's really hard to pay attention to self and the other. And so we sometimes revert back to patterns or habits that kind of start cycling, kind of dysfunctional outcomes that we're like, what's happening? Why does it always happen this way? And we might, because it's so hard to pay attention to a communication event, we might be perpetuating some habits that we may not even be aware of. So when we talk about interpersonal communication, we're going to say it relies on multiple channels to send messages. There's things that interfere with a message being sent and a message being received. Like if we're not feeling well or if we're distracted. I have some construction going on across the street. They're redoing the driveway and the cement mixer, and I'm really trying to stay focused on getting all of you this lecture today. But that is actually physical environmental noise that is providing a little bit of interference in my process. So please excuse me if I lose my flow here. I'm hoping they're going to be done soon, but I'm glad that there's people out there working away on fixing the driveway there. Okay, let's see. The other things that's interfering with us sending a message or receiving it is we have things called perceptual filters. So perceptual filters is kind of like our mindset, but it's different than just mindset in itself. This includes biases, uh, implicit biases, which means things that we're not even aware of, invisible biases, or things that we might be aware of, but they make up a part of the way that we make sense of the world. And that way we make sense of the world become filters to us in our interactions. The other things is that we say that communication has dimensions, and you'll hear me use the word dimensions a lot. There's context dimension, content dimension, and relationship dimensions. There's probably even more, but I will focus on these 3. Content dimension is the literal meaning of a message, content, CONTENT, content dimension. That's the literal meaning of the message and what I'm trying to send. A context is basically the baggage of a message. It's all our past experiences and all the societal norms and all of the implications of the context. This is everything that is the environment itself is telling us about our identity or about the type of pragmatic communication that needs to be happening, or it is context is also what we're bringing to it. So if I have to have a talk with my supervisor and the last interaction we had was a little bit rocky and I left feeling really uncertain, I'm going to bring that context in to the next interaction. The recency effect will become a perceptual filter that will make it maybe difficult for me to really tune into just what's happening in that moment. So we're in a conflict class. If you had an argument with someone or a disagreement, that recency effect will become a perceptual filter that will start to tint any interaction you have with that person the next time you see them. And there's a whole bunch of perceptual filters, self-serving bias, confirmation bias. There's a whole bunch of them, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. Positivity bias, negativity bias, things like this. The last dimension is relationship dimension. And relationship dimension is the label of the relationship. So is it supervisor, subordinate? Is it parent, child? Is it romantic partners? Is it a married couple? Whatever, siblings, co-workers, whatever is that label, because most relationships have a label, a linguistic label that gets smacked on top of it. So as soon as you smack a relationship label on the interaction, it comes with its own baggage, whether it's the past experiences, like I just mentioned, or just expectations and conventional kind of wisdoms that we hold, stereotypes we hold about how. So like a mother-in-law is a great example of I just say mother-in-law, and all of a sudden you can feel the tidal wave of the society stereotypes crashing down on an interaction. And that may not have anything to do with that relationship at all, but that does have an impact on the relationship dimension and how we interpret messages. All right. The other thing about communication, we've got through the dimensions, is that we say that communication is intentional and unintentional. So an intention is when I have a message I'm going to send and I have an intention about that. Like I definitely pushed record on this lecture with the intention of getting you all the information in an extemporaneous fashion and be as efficient as possible. But unintentionally, I don't have the full awareness to know how the message, what other things I might be doing in my messaging that might be something that the viewer is going to interpret and become an obstacle or become that I am blind to and that they see and I don't. Like my deep need to be low context and my deep need to speak with brevity, and then I'll look up at the time and I'm like, oh, that ship has sailed. I did it again. I went into a lot of detail. So intention is basically our goal going into why we're sending a message. Unintentional is that we don't really have control over how that message is going to be interpreted. Okay, so these are the two things that we're dealing with. Let's dispel some myths about communication. So communication is often put up on the pedestal. I often will turn on the television to watch a little segment about, oh, how to make your relationships work. You know, you click on that YouTube video or it's The View. They have an expert on The View or Good Morning America, and all of a sudden they'll say something like, all you need is communication. And I go, don't, no, oh, stop, give me, no. You don't just need communication. You need a very specific kind of communication. And because I'm a communications professor, I'm going to just be a little picky about this. It's one of my favorite things to be picky about, but you need functional communication. You need productive communication. You need communication that is empathetic, that has the intention of doing no harm. That is really the path to finding ways to have more stable relationships, interpersonal relationships. Communication on its own has a lot of complexity to it. First of all, we're not born experts in communication. If you know someone who's really good at communicating, whether it's in sales or they really know how to bring the team together and succeed to that win. They know how to motivate people, whatever it is that you've identified in someone that they are a communication expert. I can promise you, when they were 2 years old, they didn't have those skills. That was something that they learned, developed. They got feedback, and they failed and failed and failed and learned and learned and learned. And it's also one of the reasons why I put up the growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset information for week 1. So we can think about, if we are really going to build our communication competency skills. I do believe everyone in this class has high communication competence skills, but if we really want to build that, we need that growth mindset to understand it is an ongoing process, which I am also on that road of learning more and more, which is one of the gifts is to even teach a class like this, because I'm always learning when I teach this class as well. One of the other things we want to dispel about communication is that communication is usually held up as it'll solve your problems. We have the answer. All you need to solve this problem is communication. Well, no, that one's wrong too. Communication, you could have the best communicators, you could have expert communicators, people highly tuned in to the problem you're trying to solve, and you bring everyone into the situation, and you can still walk away with the exact same problem. My internet is blinking, so I'm going to pause this and just see if I can reboot it. I'll be right back. So we were at communication will not solve all your problems. You can still walk away with a table with problems, with the same exact problem, which is why we often see we get frustrated, we feeling like no matter what we do, we always end up kind of in the same place and the same issues. So we really want to really look at that as one of the limitations that communication can bring. This idea that communication can break down is often like a saying we say, that the communication broke down. We call that a myth too, because if the metaphor is that a car breaks down, the car breaks down, it's not working. But the truth is, communication is always happening, even if it's turned dysfunctional or toxic, or if you get ghosted, someone doesn't reply to you, they refuse to make eye contact, whatever it is, that is communication as well. So in the field of communication, when things get really bad, we don't really say that it broke down. We'll just say that communication has turned unproductive, or it has become polarizing or destructive. Okay. A couple of harder ones to understand about communication. One is that communication is inherently good, which is why we're taking it down off the pedestal, and let's really look at it, that communication is not inherently good, that communication has been used to harm other people. It can destroy people's self-esteem. It has turned people against each other to be willing to commit mass genocide. Racism often is a communicated message, or other forms of discrimination. So we definitely want to see that all of that is communication. And that's why in the field of communication, we're really in the field of ethics. We are in the field of deciding what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. And in this class, we will always come back to that kind of ethical foundation of using communication in a way that is ethical. And the last one, to just put a pin in it, that more communication is not always better. Often we get flooded, and not everybody goes through this, but some people who get really flooded, and we'll talk about this week 3. We're going to talk about what to do when your emotions start hijacking or taking control of a conflict, that more communication can actually make the problem worse and worse and worse. And I can say that sometimes you feel like you want to show the context, you want to explain it, you want to tell what the injury is or whatever it is, but all you're really doing is widening the gap of being able to connect with the other persons and moving yourself into taking a break or a listening role or a role of curiosity. But we often want to throw words at everything we do. Okay, so now that we've taken communication off its pedestal, we want to really talk about how this class is really towards the idea of building your communication competency, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. When we talk about communication competency, there's different elements to it, which kind of bring back to that transactional feeling. There's self-awareness. So someone who has really high skills with communication is a high self-monitor. And that with that high self-monitor, they are willing to accept feedback and adjust and adapt to the feedback they receive, which is really hard to do. Oh my God, it's so hard. But especially if you're in a leadership role, if you're in a more managing role, understanding how you come across to others is one of the ways that you pull forward into being more successful. So being able to take the feedback and then actually put it into action is where it gets a little sticky. Adaptability is another aspect of communication competency. So adapting means that you're willing to change, right? And not just like, I'm going to change my personality. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking that you're willing to be observant to who you're in a conversation with, or who is the listener. You're observant to the environment, and you are putting this idea of appropriateness to the relationship and context dimension and adapting to it. So I'm really hoping when you're hanging out with all your friends and you're relaxing and having a great time, that you act completely different than when you were in a job interview, right? That's what I mean by adaptability. That the way you bring yourself to a job interview or a formal occasion or a memorial service is different than how you would do if you were hanging out with your friends in a more casual location or playing around with your family, things like this, whatever that dialectical opposite might be. Okay, another element of communication competency is empathy. So empathy is being able to understand other perspectives other than your own. It doesn't mean you have to change your mind. It doesn't mean that your perspective is invalid. It just means you can hold your own perspective and your own experience and then move into an exercise of understanding another way to look at a situation that is not from your own experience. That is empathy. Often we are in often we feel these pressures to turn everything into these hierarchies of better than or less than or being comparative. And empathy is going to we're going to get a more stability that each experience has value. They're just different. Okay. Cognitive complexity is our other vocabulary word for communication competency. So cognitive complexity is a cognitive exercise that when something happens to us, whatever it is, from a conflict, tension, an injury, to good things, even good things. We want the full spectrum of it, but something happens and you can go through the exercise of thinking of why that person did that from multiple reasons. And there's an aspect of cognitive complexity that wants to have generosity and compassion and give someone room for why they behaved the way they did. So if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might be in that reactive mode. That person put my life in danger, and how are they allowed to drive? And we feel that friction and that emotional surge of anger. However, cognitive complexity is going to have you kind of roll back and go, oh, maybe that person is rushing to the hospital, or maybe someone is really late, and if they miss their appointment, they're going to get charged. And I don't know, whatever it is, you're willing to play the game of thinking of different reasons besides as an injury to you. Like if someone doesn't return your call or someone stops texting, if you feel ghosted, these would be things that you would start to play the cognitive complexity game. So we do want to create a distinction between online communication and face-to-face communication. And we definitely have lived long enough in a world of social media and emails to know that there are some problematic elements to communication when it is in this online structure, and that we want to be aware of the potentials for misunderstandings that we might, our tone of our language or our emails or our text messages might not be interpreted with the tone that we were hoping for. And that is something that, again, if you are kind of moving into this idea of being a self-monitor and self-awareness, you would be curious about this and want to find ways to adapt yourself to it. Okay. So that gives us our first kind of little foundation of communication and what we want to be thinking about with communication. The next thing I'm going to talk about is conflict. Oh, because we're in the conflict management class, OL 612. Let's go. For this part, I will move into my power slides. It looks like I have a little Google Doc of slides. I have about 9 slides, so let's see how it goes if we can get through these. That means I have to share my screen. All right, looks like we got it. Okay, so the nature of conflict. This is chapter 1, where we're really trying to be in the definition of conflict. When we talk about conflict, this class is not a conflict resolution class. It's not a debate win-lose class. This is about managing conflict. When we manage a conflict, what we're doing is we are saying that conflict is inevitable and that there is friction in our relationships, and we need to be in a place of awareness and manage those moments so we can be productive and move into growing and the benefits, growing the relationship, growing trust, growing all of those things that we need for a functional relationship. It's why it used to be called conflict resolution, but it's not called conflict resolution anymore. That's why it's called conflict management, because of this kind of ongoing process. We never say things really end. It's never really over. That is a really complicated statement. I'm just going to let it go by, but I have lots to say about that. Maybe someone will ask that as a question. I can give more. Okay. Here, when we talk about the word conflict to strike together. And when we talk about the language that we'll be using this term, we want to start thinking about what language do we use? What language do you use if you talk about conflict? How would you describe it? How would you define it? And those words that you're using are the metaphorical foundation that usually set us up for how we are going to show up in a conflict, how we react to conflict. Is it a fight? Is it a game? Is it a puzzle? Is it a fire? So fire is the metaphor I'm going to use because of conflict comes from the striking together. Uh, and uh, you can think about it has this element, the strike is the friction of the event. And the event needs fuel, it needs oxygen, and it needs that moment of friction, that striking, right? Those are the three elements of fire. And I like fire as a metaphor, and this is what I'll ask you to do when you get to your metaphor assignment, is to think about how you are going to move your metaphor into the complexity or the paradox of conflict. Because conflicts are paradoxical. They are puzzles and they really need to be managed, meaning you have to live with the contradictions of different perspectives and the different ways people experience something. Something to you may not seem like a big deal, but for someone else, they're experiencing it very differently. Or maybe you have an experience where you don't feel validated in the injury that occurred, but you and how do you navigate when you don't have that valid moment for your own experience? So just like conflicts, fire is, it doesn't take much unless you're naked and afraid and you're in a desperate need for fire to boil your water, right? Fire has to be controlled. It needs a place for it. It needs a time and how we put fuel in it so it doesn't rage out of control, but that it can be contained. And as soon as we contain the fire, aha, yes, now we can use the fire so we can boil water, so we can be in a place of survival and we can cook our food and keep ourselves warm. The need for it is an essential need. And that's what I really want you to kind of understand, to strike together and thinking about the metaphor of fire for conflict. Conflict, we need a place for it. We need to think about the fuel that we're giving it and not overfuel it. Not give it too much oxygen so it blows out of control, or the oxygen's only coming from one direction and it flows towards the others in an imbalanced way that is destructive. We want that conflict to stay contained, and now we have something we can use for making our relationships stronger. So conflict, it's an opportunity. It's going to help us be constructive in our discussions once we understand the fuels and the tools that we need, and we're going to move towards problem solving. Historically, one of the oldest connections to how we understand conflict comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle doesn't define conflict in the same way that we do in our modern sensibility, but he is defining conflict when he starts talking about anger. And what is anger? And this very important basic human emotion. It is not something we can live and not have experienced. It is a very human emotion. Aristotle wants to talk about it being about pain. And we are going to talk about the physical pain of conflict. And it's the perceived, so we have the word perception already showing up 3,000 years ago in this Western definition. The perception of a slight or an injustice directed towards us or someone close to oneself. And by close, we don't need it to be like our most connected relationships. All we need is to have someone that we have an identity connection with for us to feel the anger if they experience an injustice. And this is often why politicians or celebrities create personal brands, which you probably felt the pressure. And this is a very social media influencer wave in our culture right now, that you're somehow supposed to have a personal brand. Uh, the way personal brands are really working are for ways for tribal recognition of you, that you belong to a social tribe, a group. And then anyone in that group, if they recognize your brand, whether they know you personally or not, they become connected. And then if something happens, someone who's already created that identity bond, when an injury happens to that person, it also feels like it's happening to us. This is often why we can feel the injury of what's happening to a group of people on the other side of the planet, or why we can feel the injury when we see an individual experience an injustice or crime. That we will feel this wave of anger that brings us to the desire for revenge or retaliation. So when you understand these three parts of Aristotle's anger definition, we see how conflict has become adversarial, and it has this element, this ancient feeling of we need vengeance, we need retaliation, and that is because of this. Aristotle says this is because of a status injury. If I have a status injury, meaning you've brought me down, then the revenge is really to create a status injury to the other person and bring them down, 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 even lower, 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 depending on our thirst for revenge. So even though this is a 3,000-year-old kind of look at anger, it gives us this first pathway into getting us into our contemporary understanding of how we manage conflicts and why we shouldn't move into this place of vengeance or retaliation. Okay. I have more to say about that, but I'm going to move on to Lewis Causer's definition in 1956. So in this one's really interesting, this definition, because the social conflict, so we have this social piece of your identity, is a struggle between opponents. So that's a key word. Opponents usually means there's an adversarial relationship, just like in sports, right? We have our side and the other side, the opponents. And then over values and claims to scarce status, scarce power, and scarce resources. So this word of scarcity and status, power, and resources start bubbling up. And those are words we're still even going to use in this class, especially we're going to really try and understand what it means to be adversarial. What does it mean to be in a place of scarcity? And how is that fueling, metaphor intended, our conflicts from raging out of control? Okay, then we come to the father of what we consider modern conflict resolution or management. Morton Deutsch is the first one to really coin the win-win phrase. And his definition starts shifting from an adversarial to a more team approach, or what we call a pure, P-U-R-E, a pure conflict, which is this idea that we have incompatible goal activities, is what Morton Deutsch says. Our definition will use goals. So what I want to do is incompatible with what you want to do. And that the other party, and now we have, instead of opponent, we have a party. The other party or parties involved is interfering, disrupting, obstructing, to make my actions less effective or for me not to have my activity. And that really gets us into this idea of sabotage, that the party involved is sabotaging in my goals in this conflict. When we get to the definition of conflict we're using in this class, now we're to Hocker and Wilmot's definition in 1985, and this is the one we are using. Even though this is from 1985, which is a minute ago, it is still a strong definition, and we're using it in this class because this class is focused on interpersonal conflict. We aren't doing geopolitical conflict. We're not doing debate kind of types of conflict. We are in an interpersonal relationship class. And this is an express struggle between at least two parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. So here you're going to see the echo of the words, right? We went from one party to at least two parties, and now we're getting the real shift to the more contemporary idea that at least two parties. So the shift is from a binary approach to conflict, or an either or my side and your side. But we're understanding that the paradox of conflict is multi-sided. There's many ways, and this is why it's hard to get together and fix homelessness, or sometimes it's hard to figure out what to do with water, or how we should solve an issue in our companies, because everything often wants to be divided into this and that, but it's much more complex than that. And we don't even always know or how to articulate all the sides, which is why I'm using the word complexity. Perceive, we have the word about perception. I've already talked about perception for our communication and our biases with our perceptual filters. This idea of incompatible goals, that if you get what you want, I can't have what I want. Scarce resources, there's not enough to go around, is what a scarce resource is. And the big heavy hitters for this, of course, are time and money, which I'll talk about next week, the cultures of time and perceptions of time. And then we still are holding on to that idea of sabotage, the interference or the obstacle that the others are involved in you being able to achieve your goal. So I expect you to know this definition pretty solidly and refer to it and start integrating these key vocabulary words into the way we talk about conflict this term. And we should be using this all term long. As soon as we move from adversarial to a cooperative model for understanding conflict, we are moving into the modern contemporary understanding of conflict. And in the field of collaboration, which is a field of how to manage conflicts, when we are in a win-win or a collaborative communication event, if we are successful, the conflict becomes transformed and it no longer even looks, feels, smells, acts like a conflict. Even though it still is, that's what we mean by transformative. It's really true collaboration. And I think it's week 4, we're going to really start getting into the difference between competition and collaboration and compromise. So as promised, there are benefits to managing conflict. We have, as soon as we bring up a conflict, it's so hard to do. Oh, it's so hard. But as soon as we can have agency and we can move ourselves into how to functionally state the problem, we increase awareness for that the problem even exists. Uh, we have improved mental and emotional health, which I see I've put twice in the slide. Conflict promotes change, even though change is sometimes the conflict itself is the act of change. The change is kind of like re-entry, right? It's just sometimes there's a little bit of a shaking quake, and then you're on the other side, and we've actually got pushed through something really important, which makes us stronger. It makes us more resilient. Conflict stimulates interest and creativity. So this is another thing. If we all agree, if we all see the world exactly the same way, if there is no friction, there is no creativity. There is no innovation. So we do need those, that idea about leadership and that idea about creativity and stepping outside of other of perspectives in order to really move towards real change and create creative elements. And then, of course, we want that relationship quality. Conflict enhances relationship quality. So if we are going to be managing a conflict, the things we're doing in this class is to develop strategies. It's to, I'm going to fill your toolbox, just to think of another metaphor. I'm going to fill your toolbox full of tools. Not all these tools work all the time. I want you to learn these tools so that you can really reach for the right tool in the right moment to solve the issue that you're in. That means you have to learn how to observe. You have to understand intercultural communication. You have to become self-monitoring. You have to be in a place of curiosity or listening to understand and to learn. Often we will talk about listening skills, but we do not want, we often have habits of listening to wait for our turn to talk. And that nuance of listening to understand, of being curious, of pretending like you have no idea what they're going to say, and you're really trying to be present to what they're saying, that is a very specific skill in itself, and it's not something that is taught. So we're going to try and do that in this class. And so that is really what we're trying to do. We want to move into a different way of thinking about strategy. What are conflicts about? The progress triangle really dives into this idea of the dimensions of conflict. And I put up a picture of an iceberg because we only see one aspect of a conflict, but we want to recognize there's multiple dimensions. Oh my God, I got a heart in the corner. That's hilarious. I never know what I'm going to end up with next from Zoom. So we have here substantive dimension, procedural dimension, and relationship dimension. What Walker and Stevens were trying to develop with the progress triangle and the three dimensions of conflict is to get down deep into the under the surface of the conflict and really unpack what's happening. And it's a little bit different than goals and interests, which we're going to talk about in week 3. But just to get you started, the substantive dimension of the conflict is the concrete content, the literal conflict that is going on. What is the label of this conflict? Is it who is going to wash the dishes? Or who is going to present the report to our supervisor, whatever it is that we are trying to negotiate or problem solve, that is the concrete content of the conflict. Concrete meaning it is clear to everyone what is happening. We want to think of this as above the surface level. The procedural dimension is the process used to make decisions and that the rules that govern action. So a lot of people, me included, when I go into a conflict, I want to know, what is the rule? Well, we have a rule for that. And sometimes when rules are set up, rules are often set up in reaction to something that happened and that conflict was made. But every conflict is unique, and every conflict has different context and different players. And even going to the rule, as much as it can help, sometimes we want to address it, but we want to look at the nuance of each context of a situation. So we don't want to always lean into that procedural dimension as the only way to solve a conflict, but often we feel the pressure as managers or people in human resources because of the organizations or companies that we are a part of. We have a tendency to lean right into those procedures, and we might need to. You might not have any choice. This is the way it was agreed on. You agreed this would be the rule. You violated that rule, and here are the consequences. The relationship dimension is well, we talked about relationship dimension, so this is similar to that. It's the context between the parties, such as power, legitimacy, and face, which face is identities, and the cultural elements, the history of our relationship, uh, or if there's no history, whatever it is, all of these things become the relationship dimension that is impacting us being able to solve the conflict. So, as you're watching your television shows or your favorite movies or whatever you're partaking in storytelling, I definitely would keep keep some of this information handy, and see, especially sitcoms, they're so wildly exaggerated, like Big Bang Theory or Friends or whatever it is, that you might be able to dig out how characters react to conflicts by which dimension they seem to be leaning into. Sheldon, for example, Sheldon in Big Bang Theory is notorious for writing contracts for his relationships, his romantic relationship, Leonard and him. And anytime anyone violates anything, he goes straight to the contract and says, you're in violation of that procedural dimension. Where Leonard or the Penny, who has a much higher emotional intelligence than most of the characters on the show, really understands the importance of the relationship dimension and the nuance of the situation and the context of the situation. Okay. This brings us to the Gottman Institute. I already have a video up about the Four Horsemen in week 1. So some of you may have seen it already because I use it often. It's a great video from the Gottman Institute to define criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. But I like this image from the Gottman Institute because it's really looking at the repair. And now we're in a real modern sensibility about conflict. And I did put up a list of my influences in how I understand conflict and the people that are influencing the design of this class. So this idea of a gentle startup, we're going to talk about what does that mean, because using a gentle startup, it doesn't mean delaying the information. We still want to get to the point, especially if someone's like, hey, I have a problem. Can I talk to you? And then if you're just kind of wishy-washy about something, that's not useful either. So we do want to think about how to use brevity, get the fluff out of things, but how do we say things in a way that isn't about just snapping another arrow and attacking another person? How they react might be different, but we don't want to be the person with the arrow of criticism. So that's what using gentle startup. Basically, I think this means one way to think about this is we're going to talk about the behavior, not the person. We're also going to talk about how we take responsibility, how we lean into influence, how we are considering the other person as having some validity or legitimacy to bringing up something. So even if we may not agree, we're going to find ways that we can see our place in the issue. We're going to talk about describing your own feelings and needs. We don't want to label other people. We don't want to say, you're always angry with me when no, we just want to say, I am really not sure. I really feel I'm really feeling a lot of anger when I try to bring something up. Like we want to keep it in our own perspective and not label other people. We want to right away start avoiding saying like, you make me feel this way, or when you do this, you are making the problem worse, right? We want to avoid these you aspects and get into our own experience instead of deflecting it out. We're also going to this term really go into the neuroscience of our own mindsets and how do we get to a place where we can be emotionally regulated. Even if we have a real sensitivity or a reactive moment, we want to learn how to shift away from a full amygdala hijack or what to do when we're in a hijacking, flooding experience to get our physiological self-soothing. This means I'll probably talk about actual breathing exercise. I am definitely not going to tell you just breathe because there's right ways to breathe and wrong ways to breathe to really be self-soothing. We're going to talk about reframing and doing things so that we can move back into the dialogue in a functional way towards managing the issue. When I look at the Four Horsemen and with their anecdotes, I'm looking at one side of this slide is really about the escalation of a conflict that makes that conflict destructive. With the anecdotes, now we're looking at turning conflict into connection. We are trying to understand our own identity, and we want to move into a more productive way of managing friction or difficult conversations or difficult situations. My last slide is to remind you that conflict is inevitable, but it's also potentially beneficial. And we are going to really look at the strategy for managing conflict so you can put a plan into place. When we're managing our conflicts well, we are making decisions better, we improve our social cohesions. And I really feel like, let me stop sharing, that when I'm trying to teach you how to manage a conflict, I'm not teaching you how to be a winner and the other person to be a loser. I'm really looking at if you are going to bring something up, it's because you have bigger fish to fry than a status injury or creating a status injury in the other person, that you really want to build these connections of trust. You want to be recognized and appreciated and seen, and that we want to be in collaborative spaces where even if we can't have full control, we can never really have full control over everything that is happening around us or in our lives. We do have control over our emotional regulation and we want to start thinking about how we're going to do that. Okay. Week 1, the basics. I hope there were a couple points here that stood out to you, and that when you go to do your assignment, you can, for this week, that you can find them in here. I look forward to talking with you more. Actually, I'm looking forward to listening more than talking. Let's do more of that. Bye.